Molecule madness. Canadian Sustainability Standards Board. Counting carbon dioxide molecules is not in the public interest. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society, and today we're going to talk about the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board and their efforts to implement certain climate disclosure standards that all corporations would use to count their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and the implications, the broader implications for society, which may end up with you having to count your emissions too, although that's not particularly part of the CSSB initiative. However, this is a very complicated story that hasn't been receiving enough press, and you should know about it because the costs of these very expensive carbon molecule counting endeavors, that's counting all of these guys, that's going to fall onto you ultimately because corporations have to pay lots of money to have all their emissions counted and accounted for, but all those costs ultimately are passed on to you. And what about the small and medium-sized enterprises where mom and pop are the president and chief executive officers? They're also the janitors and everything in between. Or the medium-sized enterprises where, yes, you do have a good HR department and a good in-house accounting department, but you'd rather be rolling steel or building Quonset huts or building tractors or putting food out into the community. You'd rather be doing something productive than spending all your time and money counting carbon dioxide molecules. So I'd like to walk you through all the things that we have to discuss today. It's a bit of a long presentation, so you can certainly take a break and come back to it. There is a convergence of climate finance alignment, climate risk accounting, which is what this is about, the Competition Act changes, and censorship bills. Now, if you want some good background on the things I'll be talking about, things that are written in fairly plain language, this is a good article by Tammy Nemeth. Buckle up, business. Even more climate standards could be coming to drive up your costs. And here's another one by Tammy. Warrior accountants are at the gate, brandishing sustainability rules. And there are 3 pieces by Tom Harris in America Out Loud. Consumers will lose big time as climate activist banks control what you can and can't buy. Woke climate activist financial institutions are about to screw us all. Crippling financial standards based on junk science and UN climate bodies' unethical lobbying. And yes, I wrote one too. It's called A New World of Counting Carbon Molecules and Rationing Them. Is that coming soon? Now, a couple of years ago, Friends of Science Society submitted this consultation to the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is in London, England. And I don't think that they took it very seriously because the Canadian sustainability standards seem to be almost identical. And you can find that on our website, on our blog, under the title of this, because it's also connected to the report that Catherine McKenna did a while ago called Integrity Matters. We see mandatory climate reporting as a risk to society, and this presentation will show you why. Now, Mark Carney recently appeared before the Canadian Senate. Mark Carney is the former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England. He's a leading executive with Brookfield Investments, also with Bloomberg. He's got fingers in many, many pies. He was appointed the UN climate czar, climate envoy, he prefers. And he, in this presentation to the Senate, is pushing for a bill introduced by Senator Rosa Galvez, which is called the Bill S-243. Now, this bill is called Climate Aligned Finance, and what they're trying to do is to ensure that all banks and financial institutions make sure that all of the lenders or all of the people that they're lending to or investing in are aligned with a net zero target that's in keeping with Canada's climate targets. The problem with this is that what it means is that the costs of loans would go up dramatically. Some firms, particularly energy firms, might be denied finance or insurance, both of which are necessary for big energy projects. There is a requirement in this legislation that a climate expert be on the board of every corporation. So who's a climate expert? Oh, well, that would probably be a graduate from the foreign-funded environmental, non-governmental organizations that pepper the landscape of Canada, right? And also there would be restrictions on people who actually know the energy business. Like, I believe there's a 5-year moratorium if you've been involved in a so-called fossil fuel operation company, then you could not serve on the board of a corporation. So this would be excluding people who actually know about how energy operates in our society and implanting ideologues on the boards of major corporations across the country. I don't see how that's in the public interest, but Mr. Carney seems to think that it is. So he was advocating for that at the Senate. Now, what we're talking about today is not Senator Rosa Galvez's bill, but I am pointing out that there is a confluence of efforts from many different angles to force the climate finance community and to support a perspective, a certain ideological perspective on net zero. And as we go through this, you'll see that these are impossible targets. And I don't think it's in the public interest to force corporations to try and mark out and reach a target that's unattainable. But maybe that's just me. Let's look at more of the material. So Mr. Carney said to the Senate that we're basically laggards. He told the Canadian Senate that 4 fundamental building blocks are required: decision useful climate-related disclosure. So that means kind of disclosure that investors or the stakeholder community could look at and say, wow, that corporation is not taking care of these aspects of their operation. And in the event of some kind of a weather-related emergency, they would be at risk of losing everything. So we're not going to invest in them because we don't think that they are taking care of business in the way we think they should. So that would be a decision useful climate-related disclosure. But that's pretty hard to come by because climate is something that happens over periods of time like 30, 50, 100 years. These people are constantly conflating weather events and climate. They're not the same. But he wants decision useful climate-related disclosure, net zero transition plans, taxonomies, that's definitions that provide common definitions of transition finance, and scenario planning by financial institutions and stress testing by their prudential authorities. In these respects, Canada is lagging its international peers. That's Mr. Carney's point of view. Is that true? Well, our largest export market is the United States of America. They have no plans to do this. Our largest import market is the United States of America. Likewise, they're not doing this. So European markets are quite interested in this, but this is a very small part of Canada's main business. And we're going to be asking corporations to account for the scopes of emissions of all these different greenhouse gases. They would all be accounted for as CO2 equivalent, that's called, the equivalent impact on anthropogenic global warming. And so there's three categories. One would be direct, that would be emissions on site. Scope 2 would be indirect, that would be emissions from energy and utilities that you use. And Scope 3 would be indirect, and that would be the emissions of the chain of supply or service. So you can imagine that this is fairly easy to figure out. That's a little bit more difficult, but with some calculation, you can probably come up with a figure that's close. But this is probably very, very difficult and intricate and costly to do all of this. Now, in terms of energy production, Canada is a world leader in energy production. We're here in 6th place, and we have an equal market share to India, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. None of these countries are engaging in a similar action to count all their carbon molecules. And of course, even though these things like uranium or hydroelectricity are not fossil fuels, they also have emissions in the production and mining and generation. And energy also creates a huge amount of our GDP. So if we are going to be impinging on this sector of our market, what will replace this money that presently pays the bills for Canada? So you really have to ask yourself, is this in the public interest? And here is what we are actually focusing on today. The Canadian Sustainability Disclosure Standard, climate-related disclosures. Now, these were issued as a draft that was up for discussion, and so the submission date has passed. It was June the 10th. We did submit something to them, and I'll show you the link to it and a bit from it later on in this presentation. But I don't think it's a done deal just because submissions have closed, because this affects all of Canadian society, and very few people in the public even know about it, as far as I'm concerned. Most of the people I've spoken to have never heard of this organization, and I'll show you maybe why that's so. So first of all, if we look at some of the document, they're saying that there's a rising call for globally consistent sustainability standards. Is there? I haven't heard that. That acting by 2025 ensures that Canada remains at the forefront of global sustainability reporting efforts. Well, why should we have to be in the forefront of counting carbon molecules? We'd be the only one. And they suggest that there's an urgency for global sustainability demands. Why? Whenever someone tells you that there's some urgency, you know, if you look at all of the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, when they do the Fraud Prevention Month in March, one of the first things they tell you to be aware of and to be wary of is someone who claims that there's an emergency and you have to do something. So we should be very wary of this. And it says here that you know, that we may have mandatory application. Now, first of all, they claim that it will be voluntary, but then it will become mandatory. And the CSSB, that's the Canadian version of these regulations, were based on the IFRS, all these goofy initials. That's the organization that we originally sent our letter to back in 2022. Now, they said that only 10% of the responses for the international standards document came from Canada. So one has to ask, is this a foreign putsch? Now, it says that according to the Canadian consultation, they engaged with 169 individuals representing 127 distinct organizations in Canada. Well, who are they? Another thing that's interesting is they're willing to make in the CSSB special consideration for advancing reconciliation with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and that this is fundamental to the work of Canadian standard setting for sustainability-related disclosures, but they make up only 3% of Canada's population. How about the 97%? And timing is everything. They actually wanted this to begin already in January, but it's been put off now until 2025. And it also says here that Canada's regulators and legislators will determine whether the climate disclosures should become mandated. So first it's voluntary, then it becomes mandatory. One thing that the CSSB does note is that scenario analysis methodologies are new for Canadian reporting entities. So instead of developing a Canadian methodology, they've just piggybacked here on the technical supplement, the use of scenario analysis in disclosure of climate-related risks and opportunities from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is this was chaired by Michael Bloomberg, and of course Mr. Carney is now part of the Bloomberg organization, just pointing that out. So here really, if the ISSB and friends are so capable and admiring of such reports, they should provide the little people with an example of what they would consider the gold standard. Because as we go on, you'll see how loosey-goosey they are in their demand for compliance to a standard. So corporations will have to use climate scenarios, and of course their accounting firms will have to use them too. And yet in this document from the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, conducting climate-related scenario analysis is not without challenges. First, most scenarios have been developed for global and macro assessments of potential climate-related impacts that can inform policymakers. These climate-related scenarios do not always provide the ideal level of transparency, range of data outputs, and functionality of tools that would facilitate their use in a business or investment context. In other words, they are not fit for purpose. So why are we using them? And here's an example of the representative concentration pathways. These are very commonly used. There are a few iterations of them. This is probably the most commonly cited and most used scenario, which as you can see results in catastrophic warming. This is often termed the business as usual scenario. In fact, most of the climate organizations, science organizations in Canada claim it's the business as usual scenario, meaning that if we continue operating as we do today without dramatic change, then we'll end up at this catastrophic end. But actually it's an implausible scenario that would require us to burn up more coal than exists on the planet, for instance. And that entails 3 to 6 billion more people than could ever exist on the planet by 2100. So this is a very implausible scenario, and yet people are using it. The Bank of Canada uses it. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions uses it. And even RCP 6.0 is considered implausible. The Network for Greening the Financial System uses both of these, and they're implausible. So if we look at the Network for Greening the Financial System scenarios, we find that they are going to downscale global climate model data. What does that mean? It means that downscaling results in outcomes that run too hot. And why is that? Well, just imagine, this is a model of a climate model, or an illustration of a climate model. You can see that the world is encircled with these small grids. They're actually fairly big grids. But within them, there are mathematical equations in these three-dimensional grid cells that describe the materials in it and the way the energy moves through it. So this would be like heat, the atmosphere, advection, momentum, water, sea ice, solar radiation, terrestrial radiation. So all of these things are always churning about. And on a big scale, you can see how a climate model might be helpful in understanding or even perhaps forecasting what future climates might be. But, honestly, if we have a look at it, just imagine you're going to use that gridded climate model to try and figure out, to downscale it, to try and figure out what the impact of climate change will be on your factory in Ottawa, in Ontario, in Toronto, in Calgary, in Vancouver. It's a ludicrous assumption that could work. It's kind of like taking a size 18 suit jacket and trying to cut it down to fit a toddler. It's just not going to work. It's not fit for purpose. And yet these are supposedly the standards that corporations will have to use to report on the impact of their emissions and report in a way to investors that may become a shareholder liability issue. Because if you report on something based on these loosey-goosey climate models that doesn't happen, or that you prepare for some kind of climate emergency that doesn't happen, that's wildly exaggerated, and you've spent a lot of money trying to prepare for it, then your shareholders may have a case. And likewise, if you don't prepare for something, then all the ENGOs can engage in lawfare. You're going to be snookered by trying to do good faith compliance that may become mandatory. And not only that, you'll also have to have your accounting group try to assess whether or not you will be entering into a period of transition. That means transition to the net zero world and transition to a world that's below 1.5 degrees C or above 1.5 degrees C. And all of these calculations will have to be run to see whether or not you're going to be in a disorderly world. If so, what would you do in an orderly world where we actually all meet our targets? What would your corporation do? How would they respond? Too little, too late, we don't do enough to meet climate goals. Or the hothouse world, we continue to increase emissions and we do very little. So you can imagine that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of financial and economic and numerical variables that will have to be accounted for, including all of these guys. So it's carbon bean counting galore. Now, I'm sure that the accountants will love it, the environmental groups will love it, the big corporations can handle it, but what about the small business people? And what kind of standards are they setting? They say they're setting standards, but it turns out you can deviate. They say they note that there are challenges in aligning the timing of reporting sustainability, but these are mainly anticipated during the initial years. And the board recognizes those standards, and so they're going to give you a break. So it's all standard except for the exceptions, and it's urgent that you comply. So they're considering transition relief, but there's the urgency of global sustainability demands. So it acknowledges that scenario analysis methodologies are new, and you must comply with these standards, except for the ones you can explain away. So you need not provide quantitative information about the current or anticipated financial effects, or you need not provide quantitative information about the anticipated financial effects of climate-related risk or opportunity if you don't have the skills, capabilities, or resources. All you have to do is explain why you have not provided that. So that sounds cool, but you will be mandated to comply with these standards, and we, the CSSB, an extra-parliamentary organization, will arbitrate the degree to which you must comply. So under CSDS, you can be an officially certified non-filer. Now, how did we come to this? Well, there's a letter from the Deputy Prime Minister to the Chair of the Board of Trustees of the International Sustainability Standards. This is their foundation. And she's inviting them to open an office here and offering that the CPA Canada, the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada, would be able to provide interim office space as well as logistical and operations support. Now, actually, the CPA Canada claim that they're in support of the public interest and that the guiding principle and overarching objective of CPA Canada is enabling Canada's accounting profession to serve and protect the public. And I think corporations are included in that public as well. To meet that objective, we consistently develop and promote programs and advocate for public policy that serves consumers, businesses, and organizations. I don't know how this serves consumers, businesses, and organizations, but these people these groups are all in support of this initiative. And we'll post this link so that you can go through it at your leisure. But actually, this list does not represent the entirety of Canadian support. I don't see the ENGOs on there, so I bet there's a lot of them. So really, this is open season for shareholder lawsuits and climate activist lawfare. And if you don't see that by now, then please go back to the beginning and watch this again. So imagine being forced to report on how you'll achieve something that's impossible. If you read Václav Smil's latest report for the Fraser Institute, he shows that net zero is highly unlikely. If you read our blog post analysis by our director, Ian Cameron, who's a professional engineer, getting to net zero is impossible, unless, of course, you want to have a decline in degrowth. From our open letter submission to the CSSB that we sent on June the 10th, we noted the CSDS standards would require corporations to submit future plans based on complex and costly analysis to reach a net zero goal. The goal is clearly impossible with existing technology in the required time frame. This would force corporations to make forecasts of unknowable future technological breakthroughs. Even assuming continued technological progress, there isn't a sufficient material supply chain for the technologies proposed. The CSDS standards use climate scenarios which are deemed implausible, as I showed you, and transition scenarios that are unrealistic to address a climate risk represented by the implausible but once claimed business as usual RCP 8.5 scenario. So it's really a mission impossible and a mandatory one. And this opens the door to another thing. Scope 3 will be very hard to do. So the next step will be, what if we track what people consume to verify reporting and limit consumption? And yes, we have already done an explainer video on this, which is called Personal Carbon Ration. Are you ready for it? And it builds off this paper by Narini et al., Personal Carbon Allowances Revisited. A personal carbon allowance equals a ration. So a personal carbon allowance scheme would entail all adults receiving an equal tradable carbon allowance that reduces over time in line with national targets, encompassing individuals' carbon emissions related to travel, space heating, water heating, and electricity. People in shortage, like if you run out, would be able to purchase additional units in the personal carbon market from those with excess to sell. And oddly enough, COVID lockdowns demonstrated compliance. So in the past, it was deemed that People might not want to do this, but it shows in particular during COVID-19 pandemic, restrictions on individuals for the sake of public health and forms of individual accountability and responsibility that were unthinkable only 1 year before have been adopted by millions of people. So those authors think that people are more prepared to accept tracking and limitations related to personal carbon allowances to achieve a safer climate and the many other benefits, for example, reduced air pollution, improved public health associated with addressing the climate crisis. And they also go on to say that the Vaxport is the ticket to personal carbon ration. So curiously, the mobile apps designed for COVID-19 infection tracking and tracing played an important part in limiting the spread of the pandemic. The deployment and testing of such apps provide technological advances and insights for the design of future apps for tracking personal emissions. And it said that this COVID pandemic, this unique natural experiment give insights into possible strategies to use apps to track PCAs. So then imagine your personal carbon ration linked to a central bank digital currency, which is a kind of electronic currency, but it allows your central bank to limit the use of your money, limit the time frame that it exists, and track everything that you spend your money on. Now, as I speak, we may have been saved by the EU elections because on June 9th, 2024, most of the EU countries during their elections made a big U-turn. So, of course, they're calling it the rise of the right, when in fact it's actually the rise of people who are suffering under the burden of climate policy, but it threatens EU net zero ambitions. And part of it, we can see why these people want to enforce climate-aligned finance, because wind and solar are not profitable anymore without subsidies, and the subsidies are failing. So they're trying to force conventional energy providers into financing them by hitting them with all these climate compliance requirements. And I thought that this was kind of amazing. In brown, where Le Pen has won today in France. So basically, she swept the whole country. And we go back to Mark Carney here, where Mark Carney is telling the Senate, it's time to build. We need to get on with these issues. We need to stop debating these issues in the financial sector. I would say, after showing you what I've showed you, we need to start debating these issues in the public about the financial sector. And maybe you remember that song by Sting, Every Breath You Take. Now, I always thought that was a love song, but when you actually look into it, it's not. And Sting himself said, I didn't realize at the time how sinister it is. I was thinking of Big Brother, surveillance, and control. And he said, I think the song is very, very sinister and ugly, and people have misinterpreted it. And a sociologist named Gary T. Marks, a scholar of surveillance studies, wrote in 1988 that while the song was a love rather than a protest song, it nicely captures elements of the new surveillance, where every breath you take to breath analyzers, every step you take to ankle monitors, or one could say to your personal COVID tracking monitor, and every vow you break to voice stress analysis. I'll be watching you. So all these climate-aligned finance and compliance things are part of the surveillance society. And counting molecules, carbon molecules, and surveillance society is not about saving the planet. As Professor Richard Lindzen said a long time ago, controlling carbon dioxide is a bureaucrat's dream. If you control carbon, you control life. So if you'd like some more facts on climate change, please go to our website. You can scroll down and you'll see this image. The sun causes climate change, and over here you'll see there's 4 or 5 little points that you can go through and look at. If you'd like to help us out, you can donate. You can also join Friends of Science and become a member. Then you get our newsletters and everything, and then you have them to share with your friends and family. It's $40 a year or $80 for 3 years. Um, we are a volunteer-run organization. We are a nonprofit. We do not take money from government. We are not a proxy for any industry, and we are now in our 22nd year of operation. So we have some very loyal members who've supported us all this time. Thank you all so much. But we continue to offer our material free to the public. We have never monetized our YouTube site. So a lot of people think, oh, you've got thousands of subscribers there, you must make a lot of money. We don't. And if we had monetized it, YouTube would have deplatformed us. So it's good that we didn't, except that we don't get any financial return from that particular site. But you could send us an e-transfer. We are in our 22nd year, so $22. Contact at friendsofscience.org, or you could donate on our website, as I showed you. You can donate any amount. $1 will help. And if you're down on your luck or you just don't feel like donating, you can also just share our material. And it's really important now that you stimulate a public conversation about the things that I just showed you, because it's obviously not in the public interest to have corporations skewing markets, making up reports based on implausible climate scenarios, counting carbon molecules, spending their time doing this. Canada is in dire straits economically. We need to get back to doing the basics and stop pursuing these ridiculous climate policies that lead to nowhere but disaster. That's my little rant there at the end. Anyway, I thank you very much for watching, and please feel free to send us an email if you have other questions, and please subscribe, share, put some comments down below. I usually look at the comments and I share them with our team when there are pertinent ones. I thank you very much for watching this presentation, and there was some thunder in the background. So that ominous thunder is probably just Mother Nature's sound effect telling you how serious this really is. Thanks very much for watching. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.